A black woman is falsely accused of robbery, but what her accusers didn't realize was who her husband truly was. In the bustling heart of the city, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and people moved in a perpetual rush, lives intersected in fleeting, unnoticed moments. Amid the sea of humanity, few paused to observe those around them, unless something stood out. On what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, Julia Johnson, a poised and confident woman in her early 40s, decided to visit a renowned jewelry gallery. She had been planning this day for weeks, eager to find the perfect gift to surprise her husband, Michael, for their upcoming anniversary. Julia wasn't just any customer. She was a respected lawyer, widely known across the city for her relentless fight for equality. Her mission that day was simple: to find a piece of jewelry that would encapsulate the 10 beautiful years she and Michael had shared. But what started as a thoughtful shopping trip soon became an eye-opening confrontation with prejudice and power. The jewelry store on Madison Avenue, famed for its elite clientele, sparkled with polished glass windows displaying radiant diamonds and gleaming gold. Each piece whispered promises of wealth and exclusivity. As Julia stepped inside, she was immediately struck by the contrast between the serene, elegant displays and the chaos of the world outside. She moved toward a glass case, her eyes scanning an array of necklaces until one caught her attention, a stunning diamond pendant. It shimmered brilliantly under the soft lights, and Julia could already picture Michael's face lighting up as she gave it to him. But her moment of joy was abruptly interrupted. "Can I help you with something?" a voice asked. Julia looked up to see a tall, blonde employee standing behind the counter. Her expression was professional, but her tone carried an unmistakable edge, cold and tinged with something less welcoming. "Yes, I'd like to see this necklace, please," Julia said, gesturing toward the pendant that had captivated her. The employee hesitated briefly, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly as she assessed Julia. The look wasn't curiosity, it was a flicker of judgment, a silent question of whether Julia belonged there. Nonetheless, she unlocked the case and handed the necklace over, her smile thin and forced. Julia held the pendant delicately, watching how its diamonds refracted the light. Yet she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of the employee's gaze fixed on her. It wasn't just attention, it was suspicion. This wasn't new to Julia. She had encountered this subtle questioning of her presence before, the silent assumptions based on the color of her skin. "How much is this?" Julia asked, her voice calm but firm. The woman's lips pressed into a tight line. "Are you sure you can afford it?" she replied. The question hit Julia like a blow. It wasn't about the necklace's price, she could easily afford it. It was about the insinuation, the prejudice lying beneath the words. Keeping her composure, she responded evenly. "Yes, I'm sure." Annoyance flashed in the employee's eyes. "I think it's better if you return it to the case," she said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby customers. Julia's face burned with anger and humiliation. She carefully placed the necklace back on its velvet pad. "There's no need for that," she said, her voice steady despite the indignation rising inside her. But it was already too late. The employee signaled a security guard, and soon a tall, stern man approached them. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between the employee and Julia. "This woman was trying to steal the necklace," the employee declared, her voice carrying across the store. For a moment, Julia was too stunned to respond. The accusation was outrageous, and yet here she was, publicly humiliated, branded a thief without any evidence. "I wasn't," Julia began, but the guard cut her off. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said, his tone firm but measured. Swallowing her pride, Julia took a deep breath and nodded. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. As she walked toward the security office, she felt the weight of the customers' stares. Some whispered to one another, while others pulled out their phones to record. Julia kept her head high, determined not to let them see how deeply this moment wounded her. In the small, sterile security office, the guard motioned for her to sit while they reviewed the footage. Time dragged on as Julia's thoughts raced, replaying the scene over and over. How had her simple act of shopping spiraled into this? She knew the answer all too well. Finally, the guard returned, his demeanor softer, almost apologetic. "We reviewed the footage," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're free to go." Julia nodded in acknowledgement, but the damage was already done. She thanked the guard quietly and left the office. As she stepped back into the bustling mall, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger, the casual racism that people like her face daily, the baseless assumptions rooted in ignorance. When Julia arrived home that evening, her husband, Michael, greeted her warmly. She tried to hide the storm of emotions brewing inside her. When Julia recounted the events at the jewelry store to Michael that evening, she could no longer hold back the anger and hurt that had been simmering inside her. As she spoke, Michael listened in silence, his expression darkening with every word. "They treated you like a criminal," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "In my city. In my mall." Julia nodded, her voice trembling as she replied. "It was awful. They didn't even give me a chance to explain. Everyone was watching, and it felt like they had already decided I was guilty before I said a word." Michael rose to his feet, his fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," he declared, his tone filled with resolve. "We're going to do something about this. They can't get away with treating you like that." Julia's heart swelled with gratitude, not just because Michael was standing by her, but because she knew he had the power to make things right. Michael wasn't just her husband, he was the owner of the very mall where the incident had taken place. And now, he was ready to use his influence to confront the injustice she had endured. The following morning, Julia met with Rob, the security guard who had cleared her name the day before. They sat at a small cafe near the mall, where Rob once again apologized for the events that had unfolded. "I'm really sorry you had to go through that," Rob said, shaking his head in regret. "I could tell something wasn't right from the beginning, but I had to follow protocol." "I understand," Julia replied, her voice calm but resolute. "But this can't just be about clearing my name. This is bigger than me. It's about how people like me are treated every day. We need to expose what's happening." Rob nodded, his face thoughtful. "I agree. I've seen this happen to other customers before. It's not right." Julia's resolve deepened. "Then we need to gather evidence. I want to hold that store accountable, and I need your help." Over the next few weeks, Julia and Rob worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. They interviewed employees, reviewed hours of security footage, and collected testimonies from other customers who had experienced similar discrimination at the jewelry store. Each story painted a vivid picture of a pattern of racial profiling and prejudice that had been allowed to fester unchecked. One day, while reviewing financial records and employee files, Rob made a startling discovery. The store's manager, Claire Benson, had been in communication with a man named Richard Evans, a businessman notorious for his underhanded tactics, and someone who had been attempting to buy out Michael's mall for years. It became clear that this was no isolated incident. Richard Evans was using the store's discriminatory practices as a means to undermine Michael's business and force him to sell. Julia was stunned. What had started as an act of personal racism turned out to be part of a much larger conspiracy. She and Michael weren't being targeted solely because of who they were, but because of the power they held. With this new information, Julia and Rob prepared to take action. They compiled all the evidence they had gathered, security footage, customer testimonies, financial documents, everything they needed to confront the store's management and expose the truth. On the day of the confrontation, Julia, Michael, Rob, and a few trusted allies walked into the jewelry store armed with their findings. The store manager, Claire Benson, was waiting for them, her expression cold and unyielding. "We know what you've been doing," Julia began, her voice steady and firm. "We have evidence of your discriminatory practices, and we know about your connection to Richard Evans. This ends now." Claire's face faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly masked her unease with defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, crossing her arms. Michael stepped forward, his presence commanding and his tone low but resolute. "You've been caught," he said. "We have enough evidence to take this to court. And believe me, we will. Unless you want to lose everything, I suggest you cooperate." Claire's face paled as the gravity of the situation set in. After a tense silence, she finally relented. "Fine," she said, her voice quieter now. "What do you want?" "We want accountability," Julia said. "You'll publicly admit what you've done, step down as manager, and ensure that your employees undergo training to prevent this from ever happening again." Claire hesitated before nodding reluctantly. "All right," she muttered. "I'll do it." With that, the confrontation ended, but Julia and Michael knew their fight was far from over. This was about more than one store. It was about transforming the way people of color were treated in spaces of privilege and power, and they weren't stopping until real change was achieved. A few days later, Julia and Michael held a press conference to share their story with the world. The media turned out in droves, eager to cover the scandal that had shaken one of New York's most prestigious shopping centers. Standing before the cameras, Julia felt a surge of determination. This was her moment to demand justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "It's about the countless people who face prejudice every single day simply because of the color of their skin. It's about justice and ensuring no one else has to endure what I went through." Michael stepped forward next, presenting the mountain of evidence they had gathered, the security footage, testimonies, and financial records. As reporters eagerly took in the story, Julia and Michael stood united, ready to challenge the system and demand lasting change. Murmurs of shock and disbelief rippled through the crowd as Michael spoke with unwavering conviction. "We are calling for immediate action," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "This is not just a personal matter, it's a matter of public accountability. And we won't rest until justice is done." By the end of the day, the press conference had gone viral. Social media platforms were inundated with messages of support for Julia and Michael, while hashtags demanding change trended nationwide. The public outcry was deafening, and the pressure on the jewelry store's management became impossible to ignore. Within days, Claire Benson resigned as manager. The store announced sweeping new policies to ensure that no customer would ever again face discrimination under their roof. For Julia and Michael, it was a victory hard won, but bittersweet. Though the store had been held accountable, the emotional scars of that day lingered. Julia knew she would never forget the humiliation and pain she had endured. But as she stood alongside Michael, they both knew they had turned their personal struggle into a powerful movement for change. They had shown that prejudice, no matter how deeply ingrained, could be challenged and defeated. Days after the press conference, Julia's phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages. Some came from friends and loved ones, offering words of encouragement. Others came from strangers, people who had seen her story and wanted to express their solidarity. Many of them shared their own stories of discrimination, voices long silenced finally finding an outlet in Julia's courage. Julia felt the weight of it all. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, belittled, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. She felt a deep sense of responsibility to continue the fight, not just for herself, but for them. But with that responsibility came an overwhelming pressure. One afternoon, as Julia sat quietly at the kitchen table, her phone buzzed persistently beside her. She didn't reach for it. Michael, noticing her preoccupied state, set down his coffee and reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You've been quiet," Michael said softly, concern etched in his expression. "What's on your mind?" Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's just, all of this. It feels bigger than me now. I'm glad we spoke out, but there's so much more to do. The more I think about it, the more I realize how much change is still needed. And I'm not sure if I'm ready for all of it." Michael squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady and reassuring. "You don't have to do it all at once. You've already made a huge impact. You're opening doors for others. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. Julia gave him a small, grateful smile. Michael always knew how to ground her when things felt overwhelming. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. Her voice had been amplified, and now there were expectations. People were looking to her to continue pushing for change. Later that week, Julia received an unexpected call from Rob. "Hey, I've been doing some digging," he said, his tone serious. "And I think you need to know something." Julia's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I was going through some old reports," Rob began, "and I found out this isn't the first time there's been trouble at that jewelry store. There have been other complaints, racial profiling, discriminatory treatment, the whole thing. But here's the kicker, it's all been buried." Julia frowned, her grip tightening on her phone. "How is that even possible? How has no one said anything before?" "That's the thing," Rob replied. "People did say something. But the management hushed it up. They paid off some of the victims, and when that didn't work, they threatened others with legal action if they went public. They've been covering this up for years." Julia's stomach churned as the weight of Rob's words sank in. What she had faced was not an isolated incident. It was part of a deeply rooted pattern of discrimination, one that had been deliberately hidden from view. Her resolve hardened. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. If this store, and others like it, had been getting away with this for years, someone had to shine a light on the truth. And Julia was determined to be that someone. Julia's stomach churned as she processed what Rob had told her. This wasn't just about her. It was about a long-standing pattern of discrimination that had been swept under the rug for far too long. "We need to go public with this," she said firmly. "All of it. The people who were silenced before deserve justice." Rob nodded. "I agree. But we'll need more than just what we have now. We need people to come forward and share their stories." Julia thought for a moment, her resolve solidifying. "I'll take care of that. I'll reach out to the media, get people to speak up." In the days that followed, Julia poured herself into the effort. She contacted reporters, lawyers, and civil rights organizations, determined to build an airtight case that would expose the jewelry store's long history of discriminatory practices. Slowly but surely, former customers who had been wronged began to come forward, their voices adding weight to the cause. One woman, a single mother named Linda, shared her harrowing experience. "They accused me of trying to return stolen jewelry because they couldn't find me in their system," Linda said, her voice trembling. "They treated me like a criminal. I didn't even have the strength to fight them. I just left, humiliated." Another man, Carlos, recounted how he'd been stopped by security after browsing for wedding rings with his fiancée. "They didn't believe I was serious about buying anything," he said, his bitterness palpable. "They assumed, because of how I looked, that I couldn't afford it." Story after story poured in, each one a painful reminder of how deeply entrenched prejudice could be. It became clear that this wasn't the fault of one employee or one store. It was a systemic issue that had gone unchecked for far too long. Julia decided it was time for another press conference. But this time, she wouldn't be speaking just for herself. She invited Linda, Carlos, and several other victims to join her, giving them a platform to share their truths. The room was packed, cameras flashing as Julia stepped up to the podium. "I'm standing here today not just for myself," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "but for everyone who has ever been made to feel less than because of who they are. What happened to me at this jewelry store wasn't an accident. It was part of a pattern of behavior that has been going on for years. And today, we are here to expose it." She motioned for Linda to step forward. Though her hands shook, Linda stood tall as she spoke. "I was accused of stealing, humiliated in front of my daughter," Linda said, her voice quivering. "But I stayed silent because I was scared. I'm not scared anymore." Carlos stepped forward next, his anger evident as he gripped the podium. "I was treated like a second-class citizen, simply because of the color of my skin," he said, his words cutting through the room like a blade. "I'm done being silent. This stops now." As victim after victim shared their stories, The air in the room grew heavy with emotion. Finally, Julia returned to the podium, her words charged with determination. "We are not asking for much," she said. "We are asking for what should be given freely to everyone: respect, dignity, and the right to exist without being judged based on assumptions. And we will not stop until we see real change." The press conference marked a turning point. Media outlets ran the story nonstop, and the public outcry was deafening. Social media buzzed with calls for accountability, and people across the country demanded that the jewelry store face consequences for its actions. The pressure on the store's corporate office grew unbearable. Within days, they issued a public apology, admitting to the harm caused by their practices. They announced an internal investigation and pledged to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees. It was a victory, but Julia knew the work was far from over. This was a step in the right direction, but systemic change would take more than apologies and training sessions. As she watched the media coverage of the press conference, Julia felt a mix of emotions. Pride in what they had accomplished. Gratitude for the courage of those who had come forward. But also a simmering determination to keep pushing for justice. "This isn't the end," she thought. "It's just the beginning." Claire Benson, the manager who had allowed discriminatory practices to thrive unchecked, was permanently removed from her position. However, for Julia, that alone wasn't enough. She couldn't let the deeper injustice remain unchallenged. Behind the scenes, Julia and Rob were working tirelessly to build a legal case against the jewelry store. With the help of a dedicated team of lawyers, they painstakingly compiled every piece of evidence: testimonies, documents, security footage, anything that could strengthen their case and ensure that justice was served. Weeks turned into months as the team prepared for the trial. It was a grueling process, and the emotional toll was heavy. Yet, Julia's resolve never wavered. Every late-night meeting, every strategy session, and every recounting of her experience strengthened her determination to fight for change. Michael was with her every step of the way, his unwavering support reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Julia took the stand. Her nerves were undeniable, but so was her resolve. She understood the weight of her testimony, not just for herself but for every person who had been wronged by the store's discriminatory practices. As Julia recounted the events of that fateful day, the courtroom fell silent. Her words painted a vivid picture of humiliation and injustice, her voice carrying the strength of someone who refused to be silenced. When she finished, the air in the room was electric. One by one, the other victims took the stand, their stories forming an undeniable mosaic of the store's systemic racism. Each testimony brought a new wave of emotion, exposing the depth of the injustice. The defense argued desperately, claiming that these incidents were isolated mistakes made by individual employees. But the evidence Julia and her team had gathered was overwhelming, painting a clear picture of a pattern of discrimination that could no longer be denied. In the end, the jury found the jewelry store guilty of racial discrimination. The verdict was celebrated as a victory for justice. The court ordered the store to pay a substantial settlement to the victims and mandated sweeping changes to its policies, ensuring such behavior would not happen again. As Julia walked out of the courthouse, a wave of relief and pride washed over her. The fight had been long, exhausting, and at times deeply painful, but they had won. Justice had been served. Yet what mattered most was the precedent they had set and the change they had sparked. In the weeks that followed, Julia reflected on the journey. What had started as a deeply personal act of standing up for herself had grown into something far greater, a fight for justice and dignity for countless others. One evening, as she and Michael sat on their couch, the warm glow of the setting sun casting soft shadows across their living room, Julia leaned into him, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think we've really made a difference?" she asked quietly. Michael smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We have. You have. You stood up not just for yourself but for so many others. And you showed people that they don't have to accept injustice, that they can fight back and win." Julia nodded, resting her head against his chest. I just hope people don't forget what this was all about. They won't, Michael said softly. You've sparked something, Julia. Change is slow, but it's happening. And it's because of people like you, people willing to stand up and say enough. As they sat there in the quiet, Julia felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done. But she had proven that injustice could be challenged and change was possible. Life slowly began to return to normal for Julia and Michael, though normal now carried a deeper awareness. The battle they had fought left them more attuned to the injustices around them and more conscious of the power they held to effect change. Julia, now seen as a voice for justice, often found herself approached by people eager to share their stories. Each one reminded her of the responsibility she carried, but it also filled her with hope. The fight wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who had been silenced, wronged, or overlooked. And together they were proving that the world could be a better, fairer place, one victory at a time. Julia's resolve to push for change on a larger scale only deepened as her advocacy work expanded. She had become a symbol of hope for those who felt voiceless, and her growing influence meant more people were willing to step forward and share their stories. As Kimberly's case gained momentum, the media latched onto the narrative, drawing parallels between Kimberly's fight and Julia's earlier battle with the jewelry store. Public outrage mounted, demanding accountability from the retail company. True to form, the company's management initially tried to bury the issue, denying any wrongdoing and avoiding direct responses to the allegations. But this time, they couldn't ignore the spotlight. With the media coverage intensifying and public protests growing louder, more employees began coming forward. These new testimonies painted a damning picture, a corporate culture that systematically sidelined employees of color, ignored their contributions, and created an atmosphere where advancement was nearly impossible. What had happened to Kimberly wasn't an anomaly. It was a reflection of deeply entrenched practices. When the trial began, the tension was palpable. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, and advocates, while protesters gathered outside holding signs that demanded justice. Julia sat quietly in the gallery, watching as Kimberly took the stand. It was a profound moment. Kimberly had transformed from a scared, uncertain woman into someone who now spoke with conviction and courage. Her voice didn't waver as she recounted the details of her experiences, the microaggressions, the unfair treatment, and the promotions she had been denied despite her qualifications. I worked hard, Kimberly stated firmly. I earned the right to be considered for those promotions, just like everyone else. But I was never given a fair chance. And that's not right. The defense tried to discredit her, portraying her as disgruntled and unqualified. But their arguments couldn't stand up to the overwhelming evidence, internal emails, testimonies from other employees, and a clear pattern of discrimination. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and tears. The jury found the company guilty of discriminatory practices and ordered them to pay a significant settlement. But the victory was more than financial. The court mandated sweeping reforms, changes to hiring and promotion policies, mandatory diversity training, and the creation of an oversight committee to ensure compliance. Outside the courthouse, Kimberly and Julia stood together, surrounded by reporters and supporters. Tears glistened in Kimberly's eyes as she turned to Julia. "Thank you," Kimberly whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I could have done this without you." Julia pulled her into a warm embrace. "You did this," she said softly. "I just helped you see that you could." The case dominated headlines for weeks, sparking a national conversation about workplace discrimination. It wasn't just about Kimberly anymore. It was about every employee who had ever been marginalized or silenced. Companies across the country took notice. Many began reassessing their policies, terrified of becoming the next public scandal. Change was slow, but it was happening. For Julia, the victory was both gratifying and bittersweet. It was a step forward, but she knew the fight wasn't over. There were still countless people facing injustice, still systems that needed to be challenged and reformed. One evening, as she reviewed emails from others reaching out for help, Julia allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She thought about how far they had come, from her own humiliating experience at the jewelry store to standing on the steps of the courthouse with Kimberly. The work ahead was daunting, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was possible, one story, one step, and one victory at a time. And as long as people like Kimberly were willing to stand up and fight, Julia knew they were building something powerful, something that could make the world a little bit fairer for everyone. The Justice Collective launched with an event at a local community center, a modest space that quickly became a symbol of hope and possibility. On the night of the event, the hall was packed. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds filled every seat, with many standing along the walls or spilling out into the entryway. There were reporters with cameras ready to document the moment, lawyers eager to lend their expertise, and activists fired up to mobilize their communities. Some attendees came out of curiosity, while others carried stories of personal pain and frustration, but they all shared one common purpose: they wanted to be part of something meaningful. When Julia stepped onto the stage, her heart raced with anticipation. She paused, scanning the crowd, feeling the collective energy radiating back at her. Gratitude swelled in her chest as she thought about how far she'd come, and how far they could go together. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Julia began, her voice strong but tinged with emotion. "The Justice Collective was born out of a personal fight for dignity and respect. But today, it stands for something much bigger. We are here because no one should have to face injustice alone. We are here because change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when we stand together." Applause rippled through the crowd, filling the room with a vibrant, hopeful energy. "This is just the beginning," she continued. "There's a long road ahead, and there will be challenges. But with every case we take on, every voice we amplify, and every system we hold accountable, we're moving closer to the world we all know is possible, a world where no one is judged by the color of their skin, their gender, their background, or their beliefs. A world where justice is not just an ideal, but a reality for everyone." The applause turned into a standing ovation, the energy in the room electric. By the end of the event, the Justice Collective had gained dozens of new supporters, volunteers, and donations. It was clear that Julia's vision had resonated deeply with people who were tired of waiting for someone else to step up. They wanted to be part of the change. In the months that followed, the Justice Collective grew rapidly. The organization took on cases that ranged from workplace discrimination to housing inequality to police misconduct. Every victory, big or small, strengthened their resolve and amplified their message. But the work was far from easy. For every step forward, there were moments of frustration and setbacks. Some cases dragged on for years, tangled in endless legal bureaucracy. Resistance from powerful corporations and institutions was fierce, often forcing Julia and her team to fight tooth and nail for even the smallest wins. One case, a class action lawsuit against a national retailer accused of widespread discrimination, became a turning point. The retailer's legal team was well-funded and relentless, using every tool at their disposal to discredit the plaintiffs and stall proceedings. After one particularly grueling day in court, Julia came home exhausted, her confidence shaken. Michael was waiting for her, and as soon as she walked in, he saw the weariness in her eyes. "I don't know if I can do this," Julia admitted as she sank into the couch. "This case, it's too big. They're too powerful. It feels like no matter what we do, they're always one step ahead." Michael sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've come this far, Julia. Don't forget what you've already accomplished. These things take time, but you're fighting the right fight, and that's what matters. I just don't want to let anyone down," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So many people are counting on us." "You won't let them down," Michael assured her gently. "You're not fighting alone. You've built something incredible, and you have a team that believes in the same things you do. Trust them. Trust yourself." Julia nodded, feeling a small spark of hope reignite in her chest. She couldn't lose sight of the bigger picture, the change they were working toward, even if it felt painfully slow at times. Months later, the case against the retailer reached a breakthrough. After years of tireless legal battles, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The evidence of systemic discrimination was undeniable, and the verdict sent shockwaves across the country. The retailer was ordered to pay a significant settlement and implement sweeping changes to its policies, including mandatory diversity training and a restructuring of its hiring and promotion practices. It was a monumental victory, not just for the individuals involved but for the message it sent to other companies: no matter how powerful you are, you cannot escape accountability. As news of the verdict spread, Julia's phone buzzed with messages of congratulations and gratitude. She stood in the office of the Justice Collective, surrounded by her team, and felt a sense of pride she could barely put into words. They had faced one of their toughest battles yet, and they had won. More importantly, they had shown the world that change was possible, even against the odds. Julia looked around at her team, a group of people as passionate and determined as she was. She knew there were more battles to fight and more systems to dismantle, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a moment to simply be. "One victory at a time," she said aloud, her voice steady and full of resolve. And with that, they got back to work.